Hello and welcome to my video. This time we're looking at the history of peat extraction on the Somerset levels. So let's get started. Peat has been a very important industry in the Glastonbury area. It has preserved ancient archaeology and was a vital source of fuel. For locals, it has provided rich grazing through dry summers and in the 20th century was a major employer in the area. And now, the worked out areas shown here in blue on the map provide an important nature reserve offering bird watching, walking and cycling. So, what is peat? Peat is the partially decayed remains of organic matter such as trees, mosses, sedges and reeds. It forms in wet areas where acidity and low levels of oxygen halt decay. The peat around here was formed 6,000 to 7,000 years ago up until around 400 AD. The different layers of peat have different names such as light peat, best black peat and fen peat. As I mentioned earlier, peat is brilliant at preserving archaeology and in particular the Sweet Track and the Glastonbury Lake Village. Importantly, it has preserved the pollen record, giving us an indication of what the surrounding landscape was like through the years. Wet peat is like sponge but can be dried into hard blocks called turves, which are then burnt as fuel. The Romans used peat to heat salterns, the pans they used to extract salt by boiling seawater. In medieval times, people living on higher ground had turbary rights to dig peat on the marshes, which were then common land. Each parish would have an area of peat moor for grazing, thatching reeds and fuel. Locals would dig it during the summer, drying it and selling it at market during the winter. As with all traditional and historic industries, peat digging developed a language of its own. Entire families would be involved. The men would be digging mumps and cutting them into turves, while the women and children built the hiles, the tates and the ruckles. This was hard physical work. A freshly dug wet mump could weigh 28 pounds or 12 kilo. The 19th century saw the coming of the canal and shortly after that the railway. This vastly improved transportation and led to the development of large companies such as Eclipse and Fisons and the growth of the market. Let's listen to Pete Lovell, who used to be a peat worker here, talking about loading the canal boats.
Well, you pushed them on, load them, throw them in, and then when you got up to the edge of the boat, you had to pack them round, stop them falling in the ditch. And then when you got your thousand on, you just hop across from the wheelbarrow with a bit of luck onto the top of the boat, and then you had to pull it back round to the main ditch from Cuckoo Ditch. Cuckoo Ditch used to run off left, almost down to Ascot Corner. There was a signal post then when the railway was there, and just this side of Cuckoo Ditch. Then you had to pull it back up to Sharpen Crossing. And then if it came into the side, touching the bank, you had to have the pole and push them out again, push the boat out again, because you understand if you're pulling the boat, eventually come into the bank so that you can load them onto a cart straight on the road.
A major player in the development of local peat industry was the Eclipse Peat Company, owned by the Alexander family. By the early 20th century they had built a factory here and were producing peat litter for bedding for animals and hummel, which was used in putting greens and racecourses. As the business grew, so did the need for labour. Families still worked on the moors digging the peat, but now they needed men to work in the factories and to operate the extensive 2-foot gauge rail network that hauled the dried turf off the site. The largest of the factories, known as Great Plains, was bang in the centre of what is now the current nature reserve. By the 60s, peat was no longer used as fuel, but instead huge quantities were now sold for horticulture. Output was expanded through the use of powered peat cutting machines. By this time, peat was being sold in plastic bags in the newly emerging garden centres up and down the country. Eventually the firm was sold to the national giant Fisons, when the annual turnover reaching 65,000 tonnes. By the early 90s, through national marketing, Fisons had increased its production to 250,000 tonnes, but around this time people were waking up to the environmental impact of the industry. A huge campaign followed, with outlets being boycotted, resulting in national retailers such as B&Q refusing to sell the peat. There were even questions asked in Parliament. The upshot of this was in 1994 Fisons pulled out of the peat market altogether. This spelt the end of large-scale excavation in the area and many people lost their jobs. Peat digging still continues to this day, but on a far smaller scale. Local farms that have operated for many decades still provide employment. However, the small companies now work closely with the conservation organisations on matters such as water level control and after use. Mechanical diggers have replaced hand shovels, but rows of ruckles running across the fields can still be seen. When Fisons closed, the land was handed over to English Nature, who later became Natural England. The land at Ham Wall became an important RSPB reserve. Further land at West Ham Moor was transferred to the Somerset Wildlife Trust to extend their already existing reserve. A few smaller areas are still under the control of Natural England. This area is now a treasured resource. Ham Wall, for example, twice a year is home for the largest starling murmuration in the United Kingdom. A network of hides make the place a twitcher's heaven. Also running straight through the site is the course of the Somerset and Dorset Railway that is always packed with bikes and walkers. This area will continue to be a wonderful place to visit and will stand as a testament to all the folk, like Peter Lovell, who have worked here through the years. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please like, and if you're not already, please subscribe. And I will see you on the next one. Thanks again. Bye.